I never imagined the kind of humiliation that comes not from strangers but from the people who are supposed to protect you. Family dinners are supposed to be safe, noisy, imperfect, filled with the kind of petty grudges that everyone ignores in the name of love. But sometimes the petty grudges become blueprints for betrayal. This is the account of how one offhand, cruel sentence from my brother turned an ordinary anniversary celebration into the place where decades of deceit collapsed. I want to take you through the entire night, the build-up, the small signs I missed, the recording that changed everything, and the tidal wave that followed. If you've ever been cast out of a family circle or felt the sting of being treated like an outsider by blood, this will strike a chord. If you've never felt that, it might make you grateful for the quiet, solid people beside you. Either way, this story shows how fragile honor can be when placed in the hands of someone who thinks success equals entitlement. Growing up, Mark and I had the kind of childhood that looked normal from the outside: school events, blows to the knee from climbing too high trees, and my mother scolding us for tracking mud through the house. But behind that facade, there was a steady stream of small competitions, grades, attention, and later, opportunities. He always tried to one-up me, whether it was finishing the school race a second earlier or getting praised for the piano recital I forgot to practice for. My parents tried to be fair. They tried to balance praise, distribute chores, and create the illusion of equality. But fairness in a family is a precarious thing, and my brother's sense of superiority grew like mold, slow, unseen, and eventually pervasive. When he left for university and then for a high-paying job in the city, something changed. The distance didn't make him kinder. It made him colder, more self-assured. He came back with a new vocabulary, phrases like ambition, networking, and planning ahead, delivered with the sort of smugness that suggested he'd been promoted not just professionally but morally as well. He started dressing better, talking louder at family gatherings, and flinching at anyone who didn't meet his new standard of success. It wasn't immediate. It took years. But by the time my parents announced a big anniversary dinner, the tension between us had become a thin, brittle thing that could snap at any moment. I was excited for the anniversary. My parents had been married for 40 years, which I thought deserved a celebration that would bring everyone together. I picked out a shirt I thought looked nice, bought the cake they loved, and rehearsed compliments in the shower. I told myself this would be a night of small reconciliations, of awkward hugs smoothed over with laughter. But when I walked into the restaurant and saw Mark sitting at the head of the main table, flanked by a cluster of relatives and his fiancée, the celebration's warmth became a spotlight illuminating everything I hadn't wanted to face: the distance, the resentments, the invisible boundary lines he had been drawing for years. He noticed me the instant I entered, his face rearranged into that smug half-smile he wore when he believed he'd already won. I walked over with the cake, reaching for the chair beside our parents as if there had never been a question about where I belonged. He didn't even look up from his conversation. He let me approach. Then, with the kind of practiced cruelty that comes from repetition, he said, "Sorry, this table's for family only," enunciating each word with the sharpness of a blade. Time stalled. People laughed at first, an awkward reflex to diffuse the sting, but the joke didn't land. I stood with my hand on the chair, the cake in my arms, feeling the heat of 100 small judgments focus on me. My mother's face was a study in confusion. My father's eyes flicked between us like someone trying to find a clue in a riddle. My aunt pretended not to notice. Julia, Mark's fiancée, gave me a look that was not merely cold but pleased, like someone who had seen the execution of a plan succeed. I remember sitting at a corner table, small, out of the way, as if I were some extra plate in the world. The waiter's polite overflow seating felt like a slap. I tried to smile, to chalk it up to family theatrics, but the seed of something dark had been planted. A cousin came to sit with me, rolling her eyes at Mark's behavior, whispering that he'd been like this ever since the engagement. She hinted that he had been telling the family I was distant and unreliable. The words didn't make sense. No one who really knew me would call me unreliable, but the suggestion had been planted, and I could tell it had been delivered with calculation, not accident. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Mark had been building a narrative for months, maybe years. He'd been whispering into the right ears, sharing half-truths, and presenting himself as the responsible one. He'd leveraged our parents' love and their natural inclination to protect the family's future. But somewhere along the way, he'd gone further. He'd recorded conversations, secretly, casually, betraying not only his siblings but his own conscience. And someone had access to those recordings. Whether it was Julia acting out of spite, or a cousin tired of Mark's manipulation, those recordings were ready to be used. The slideshow began. The kind of sentimental collection of photos that turns adults into toddlers for 2 brief minutes. There were old wedding photos of my parents, grainy shots of holidays, pictures of us with cake on our faces. For several minutes, the room was a safe harbor of nostalgia. Then, without warning, a clip appeared. It wasn't part of the planned montage. It was jarring because it was raw, Mark speaking on the phone, unguarded and arrogant. Once Mom and Dad sign the papers, everything is mine, he was heard saying, casually gloating about a plan that had been whispered into existence until it became a perceived inevitability in his mind. The gasps were immediate. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. My father, who had always been a gentleman, looked like someone who'd been hit. Mark's face shifted from control to panic so quickly it was almost comical. If the situation hadn't been so devastating, he lunged toward the laptop, shouting for it to be turned off. But the damage was done. The words were out, the proof visible to everyone who mattered. There are moments in life when a person's true self is revealed not by what they say in public, but by what they say when they think they're alone. Mark's private voice was a betrayal, plans, manipulations, dismissive comments about the family he was supposedly protecting. The more the footage played, the more it painted a picture of a man who had been carefully constructing his version of the future, one that required erasing those who didn't fit his image. Starting with me. My father's reaction was the most heartbreaking thing in the room. He rose from his chair, the way a man does when something sacred has been violated. Is this true? He asked. The question a simple, devastating thing. Mark stammered, attempted to minimize, to explain away the moments recorded, to claim he'd been rehearsing or venting. He started to cry when he realized those tears would do him no good. Tears are persuasive when they're real, but when you've been caught orchestrating a betrayal, tears look like another performance. Then, as if the universe needed to press the point, another clip played, this one with a different sort of intimacy. In it, Mark was heard speaking casually to Julia, the two of them laughing about their plan as if it were a game with no moral stakes. He said, without apparent regret, that once the papers were signed he wouldn't have to deal with the dead weight of certain family members. Julia laughed, the sound brittle and sharp, and the camera caught her expression, part triumph, part complicity. It's a strange, terrible feeling to watch people you trusted speak of you as if you don't exist. But that is precisely what happened in that room. My mother sobbed openly. My father's face had drained of color. Cousins whispered with a mixture of shock and betrayal. And then Mark tried to leave. He moved as if he could walk out of the scene and leave the consequences behind. But my mother's voice stopped him. You do not get to walk away, she said, and it was one of the clearest sentences I've ever heard from her. She looked at him not as a son but as someone who had failed a basic human test. The fallout after that night was a slow, brutal unspooling. Weekdays became battlegrounds for conversations I never wanted to have. Relatives called to hear my side, to ask if I was okay, to listen and then offer platitudes that felt thin. Some relatives, who had previously been friendly with Mark, shifted their stance. Their trust eroded like shoreline under tide. Other relatives, surprisingly, defended him, offering explanations that tried to fit the pieces into a narrative where Mark was simply overzealous but not malicious. I learned that people will always choose narratives that keep their world comfortable, even if it means excusing wrongs. My parents, of course, were shattered. The discovery forced them to confront a terrible question. How did we raise someone who could plan to cut the family apart? My father, who had always been a quiet man, became a whirlwind of regret. He replayed conversations, trying to find the moment he could have changed course. He read every message between Mark and him, tried to understand how influence had taken hold. It was heartbreaking to watch him reconstruct his reality. My mother retreated into herself for a week, not wanting to speak to anyone, and then slowly began the process of confronting the truth with a courage that surprised me. She began apologizing, not to Mark, but to me, for not seeing sooner, for not protecting me from the narrative that had been spun. Mark, predictably, did not take responsibility. He alternated between denial and excuses, trying to claim that he had only been trying to protect the family from what he said were my irresponsibilities. He threw around phrases like, for their own good and someone had to be practical. It infuriated me. mostly because he seemed incapable of understanding that manipulation and secrecy are not protection. They are cruelty. The community reaction was mixed. Some friends stopped inviting Mark to events, others kept seeing him, unwilling to choose sides. It was a reminder that truth is messy. Some people will always find reasons to forgive, others will distance themselves, and many will watch from the sidelines, waiting to see which version of events will be the final one. Social media, when it got hold of the story, was unforgiving. Rumors spread, some true, some exaggerated. The man I thought I knew and the man the world was now seeing were not the same image, and reconciling the two was harder than I'd imagined. In the months that followed, family meetings became common. We had lawyers come, not immediately for litigation but to sort practical things. How would my parents' affairs be managed now that trust had been compromised? Would they rework their arrangements? Would they include safeguards to prevent unilateral decisions? My parents, whose priority had always been to avoid legal conflict, found themselves signing documents that made things more transparent. It was painful to watch them accept the necessity of bureaucracy in a family that had formerly relied on trust. The emotional fallout was more complex. I had to grieve not just the betrayal but the childhood illusions it came from. I grieved the brother I'd thought I had, someone who might cockily boast about a promotion but still show up at a wound with a bandage and a joke. I grieved the idea of a family as an unbreakable unit. But grief, oddly, made room for something else, clarity. The truth had cleared the fog. I could now see who in my family had my back, who had been complicit in silence, and who had simply been unaware. One of the most surprising outcomes was how some relationships strengthened. My parents and I found a new level of honesty. We started sitting down over tea, not to avoid difficult topics but to confront them openly. We redesigned the way we handled finances and healthcare decisions, putting things in writing and ensuring multiple checks to prevent unilateral maneuvers. We hired a financial advisor to help keep things transparent, and even though each step felt bureaucratic and cold, there was relief in the safeguards. Mark, meanwhile, had to confront consequences he could not charm away. He lost trust, which in its own way meant he lost leverage. People began to question his motivation in other areas of life. Friends who once flattered him now spoke in measured tones. Julia, who had been part of the recordings, distanced herself in a way that suggested she'd miscalculated the weight of what she was complicit in, whether it was guilt or fear of association. She stopped attending family events. Mark's regrets, when they came, were late and unconvincing. He apologized in a message that read like an exercise in damage control rather than a heartfelt confession. Years later, when the dust settled enough for me to breathe, I realized the night had given me something unanticipated: agency. When someone tries to erase you from their narrative, the easiest thing is to let it happen and sink into passive acceptance. I did not do that. The exposure forced an awakening. I no longer waited for inclusion. I sought connection elsewhere, friends who felt like family, neighbors who became confidants, and cousins who stepped in to bridge the gap. It wasn't the same as the family I had before, but it was truer. There were moments of awkwardness after the scandal, awkward holiday dinners, invitations declined and later accepted with strained smiles, conversations that had to be navigated like minefields. But there were also moments of laughter and small reconciliations that felt earned rather than given. People who had been distant suddenly became present when they realized how fragile trust could be. Some relatives apologized for staying silent, admitting they'd suspected something but feared rocking the boat. Those apologies were imperfect, but they mattered. As for Mark, life continued, but layered with consequences. He struggled in ways that were his own doing, professional relationships strained by the personal scandal, friendships that eroded, and the constant knowledge that one careless recording had undone part of the life he'd been trying to build. Regret, when it arrived, was not cinematic. It was messy, apologies that were too late, attempts to reconnect that felt like grasping at smoke. Sometimes he reached out, and I responded. Sometimes I didn't. I learned to set boundaries that protected my peace, which was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Today, when I look back at that anniversary dinner, I don't see just humiliation. I see a turning point. I see how the exposure of truth, painful as it is, can be a kind of liberation. The tables we sit at in life, literal and metaphorical, are not always assigned by birthright. Sometimes we are excluded, sometimes we are invited, and sometimes we choose to walk away. What matters is who chooses to stand by you when the lights go dark. Family, in the truest sense, is not automatic. It is earned, chosen, and sometimes redefined. If there's a moral here, it's not an easy one. It's not always forgive or always cut ties. It's that truth has a way of finding its moment. And when it does, what you do with that moment defines you. For me, that night was a cruel lesson in human frailty and the surprising resilience that follows. My brother's smirk is gone from the photos now, replaced by something softer on his face when it exists at all. Life moved on. People made choices. And I discovered that being excluded from a table does not mean you don't belong anywhere. It just means you have to find or build a table where you are wanted, and when you do, the company is that much richer for it.